The air is cool over the hills of Anatolia, softened by a veil of morning mist as the first light spreads across the land. Out of this quiet rises a mound that once seemed ordinary, overlooked for centuries as nothing more than part of the landscape. Yet beneath it lay one of the most astonishing discoveries of the modern age. This is Göbekli Tepe, the oldest monumental structure known to humankind. And what if Göbekli Tepe proves that the history we have been taught about our beginnings is not the whole story? What if its stones are evidence that civilization began far earlier and in ways far more complex than our textbooks admit? Carbon dating places the site between 9,600 and 8,000. Before the Common Era, that makes it older than the pyramids of Egypt by more than 7,000 years, and long before the first stones of Stonehenge were set in place. Scholars now recognize it as the earliest monumental architecture yet discovered. And here is the puzzle. It was not built by settled farmers or organized city dwellers. It was raised by people still described in our books as hunters and foragers. Without permanent towns, without crops to sustain them, they cut and lifted massive T-shaped pillars, some more than 5 meters tall and weighing close to 10 tons. The stones were carved with foxes, boars, vultures, snakes, and scorpions. Some bore human features such as arms and belts, as if they were meant to stand as guardians over sacred ground. The modern story of Göbekli Tepe began in 1994, when the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt examined the site that local villagers had long thought was an ordinary hill. Earlier surveys in the 1,960 seconds had dismissed it as little more than a cemetery, but Schmidt saw fragments of carved stone and realized something remarkable lay beneath the soil. Excavations revealed circles of towering pillars, carefully shaped and deliberately placed. The discovery overturned long-held beliefs about the rise of religion, art and architecture, and it forced scholars to question the very sequence of human development. And then came the deeper mystery. Around 8,000, before the Common Era, after centuries of use, Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned to time. It was buried with intent. Tons of rubble, broken tools and animal bones were used to fill the enclosures, sealing the stones away. This was not the collapse of nature, or the slow fading of neglect. It was a deliberate act, as if those who built it wanted it hidden. Why would they cover the very monuments they had raised with such care? What knowledge, what memory, or what fear was powerful enough to demand that silence? In the stillness of these hills, the questions echo. Who were the people who built Göbekli Tepe? How could they quarry and move such immense stones without the tools and animals we associate with later ages? What meaning lies in the carvings of predators and birds, or in the human-like forms etched into the pillars? And what compelled them, after generations, to cover the site as though erasing it from history? As we follow this mystery, we will look at its beginnings, its achievements, its sudden burial, and the echoes it may have left in later traditions and myths. Each step opens a window into a past that does not match the story written in our books, a past that suggests civilization may have begun earlier and in stranger ways than we have been taught. If you are drawn to the hidden chapters of history, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Göbekli Tepe was only a ritual site for early hunters? Or could it be the key to a forgotten civilization that proves history is wrong? To begin uncovering the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe, we must first step into the land and the time in which it was born. High on a limestone ridge above the wide Urfa plain in southeastern Turkey, the site commands a view of the horizon in every direction. Today the ridge is pale and dry, but more than 10,000 years ago the world looked very different. The Ice Age had ended. The earth was warming, rains fell more often, and the hills turned green with grasses. Herds of gazelle and aurochs moved across the valleys, while wild sheep and boar foraged among the thickets. Almond and pistachio trees spread across the slopes, heavy with fruit in their season. It was a landscape filled with food, water, and life. A land that allowed people to pause, to gather, and to dream of something more than the endless wanderings of survival. For centuries, the mound on this ridge appeared ordinary. Villagers ploughed its soil, grazed their animals, and passed it without much notice. In 1963, a joint survey by the University of Istanbul and the University of Chicago walked across its slopes. They collected flint tools scattered on the surface and recorded stone protrusions that they believed belonged to two small Islamic cemeteries. What they were really seeing were the tops of ancient pillars, but at the time no one could have imagined it. The mound was written into the records and forgotten, its secret kept in silence for another 30 years. In 1994 the story changed. Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist working with the German Archaeological Institute, came to the ridge. He had studied other Neolithic sites in the region, but here the limestone fragments caught his eye. They did not look like natural breaks in the rock. Their edges were too sharp, their surfaces too carefully smoothed. Where others saw random stone, Schmidt saw deliberate carving. He realized this was not a cemetery at all, but something far older. Excavations began in 1995, and year after year the soil was peeled away. What emerged from the ground was nothing like what the textbooks had taught us to expect. The layers of Göbekli Tepe tell their story in sequence. The deepest belongs to the pre-pottery Neolithic A, between roughly 9,600 and 8,800 before the Common Era. Here stood immense circular enclosures, defined by T-shaped pillars set into sockets cut into bedrock. At the centre of each circle rose two even larger pillars, facing one another like silent guardians. Some stood more than 5 meters tall and weighed nearly 10 tons. To carve, move, and raise them required skills in quarrying, tools for shaping, and coordination of labour that hunters and foragers were never supposed to possess. Above these circles lies another layer, the pre-pottery Neolithic B, beginning around 8,800 before the Common Era introduced a new chapter. The great open rings gave way to smaller rectangular rooms. The pillars were shorter and less imposing, but the builders had discovered something extraordinary. Their floors were made of terrazzo, created by burning limestone into lime, mixing it with crushed stone, and spreading it into gleaming white surfaces. To stand on such a floor 10,000 years ago was to stand on a creation of chemistry and fire, something deliberate and permanent. This technology was not supposed to exist in a world without farming or towns, yet here it was, on a ridge in southeastern Anatolia, shining against the Sunday. The contrast between these layers is striking. In the earlier phase, the open circles spoke of gatherings beneath the sky, places that brought many together. In the later phase, the spaces narrowed, walls defined smaller rooms, and polished floors reflected a sense of enclosure and permanence. It is as if the community itself was shifting, from broad rituals uniting large numbers to ceremonies carried out in more controlled spaces. Architecture was no longer only shelter. It became expression, shaping how people moved, stood, and experienced the sacred. All of this unfolded in the early Holocene, a turning point for both land and people. The glaciers of the north had retreated, leaving behind a gentler climate. Winters softened, rains grew steadier, and life began to follow new rhythms. Communities no longer faced the constant scarcity of the Pleistocene. They could return to familiar places, gather in larger numbers, and weave rituals into the cycles of the seasons. Archaeologists still call them hunters and foragers, yet here they were carving stone, raising pillars, and laying polished floors. These are not the acts of people wandering endlessly. These are the acts of people who are beginning to shape permanence into the land. Other sites from this same period hint at a wider change. At Jericho, a tower and a wall rose from the earth. At Nivali, Kori and Kayonu, shrines were built. But none of these came close to the scale or ambition of Göbekli Tepe. On this ridge above Sanliurfa, the builders raised something larger, older, and stranger than any of its neighbours. It is here that the boundaries of history blur, for Göbekli Tepe seems to overturn the sequence we were taught. Textbooks say farming came first, then villages, and only then temples. Yet here the temple came first. The sanctuary rose before the field. The order of civilization is reversed. The details of its discovery and its layers may sound like the language of archaeology, but they are more than dates and measurements. They are signs of a people who dreamed in stone. The sockets cut into bedrock speak of minds that planned ahead. The terrazzo floors reflect the leap of imagination that transformed raw limestone into shining surfaces. The shift from circles to rectangles whispers of changing ideas, of rituals, evolving from open gatherings to enclosed ceremony. What lies in those layers is not only architecture but messages in stone. They challenge us to ask whether our story of beginnings is complete. To understand what the builders of Göbekli Tepe truly meant, we must now look closely at the pillars themselves, at the carvings and the mysteries they still hold. If you are still with us, press like to let us know. To step into the circles of Göbekli Tepe is to walk into a place that should not exist in its time. Imagine standing on the ridge as the soil is cleared away. From the dust, pillars rise one after another, taller than a man, carved from solid blocks of limestone. At the heart of Enclosure D stand two immense monoliths, each more than 5.5 meters high and weighing close to 10 tons. Around them 12 others form a great ring, their flat tops gleaming in the sunlight, as if they were once meant to hold the sky itself. A short walk away, the quarry still lies open. Here in the stone itself, the process of creation is preserved. Grooves cut deep into the rock show, where the builders struck with flint hammers. One monolith remains unfinished, half freed from the bedrock, as though the workers left it behind in mid-motion. It is not hard to picture them, dozens of people pulling ropes in rhythm, wooden levers creaking, the massive block inching forward across the ridge. There were no wheels, no oxen, no metal chisels. Every pillar was born of human strength and human vision. To see them standing today is to feel that vision pressing forward from a world that should have known none of it. In 1997, archaeologists noticed something even more startling. On some of the central pillars, arms run down the sides, hands fold at the belly, belts cross the waist, and loincloths hang below. Pillars 18 and 31 inches. Enclosure D show these features most clearly. These are not abstract stones. They are human-like beings, guardians of the circle, standing in silence for more than 10,000 years. They blur the line between statue and structure, between the living and the stone. What were they meant to be? Ancestors remembered in colossal form? Spirits given shape to protect the sacred? Or something else entirely? The answer is gone, but the presence remains. The pillars speak also in animals. Their surfaces are alive with foxes, wild boars, and aurochs with heavy horns. Vultures spread their wings wide. Snakes coil upward. Scorpions crouch, ready to strike. Each relief is carved with precision, as though the builders knew these creatures intimately. On Pillar 43, often called the vulture stone, the message grows darker. First recorded in detail in 2002, it shows a human figure without a head beneath vultures, snakes, and a scorpion. Some scholars see a ritual of death, a reflection of practices in which bodies were left to the birds before burial. In 2017, others suggested something even more haunting, that the stone encodes the memory of a great catastrophe, the sudden cooling of the Younger Dryas more than 10,000 years ago. If that is true, then the vulture stone is not only ritual art, it is a record of disaster, carved to endure when memory fades. The meaning remains uncertain, but the question is clear. Why would the builders choose to preserve such an image, and what did they hope the future would understand? By 2003, geophysical surveys revealed that what had been uncovered was only a fragment of the whole. At least 20 more enclosures still lie buried beneath the mound, holding more than 200 pillars yet unseen. Only a few have been excavated. The rest remain sealed, their carvings turned inward, their silence unbroken. If what is already visible has shaken our view of the past, what will the hidden pillars reveal when they finally come to light? The story of Göbekli Tepe is written not only in its towering stones but in the smaller traces of life around them. By 2019, more than 7,000 grinding tools had been found, mortars, pestles and plates worn smooth from use. Microscopic analysis revealed the remains of cereals such as wild barley and einkorn. This does not prove farming, but it does prove that grain was processed here on a vast scale. The number suggests feasts that drew hundreds, perhaps more. One can imagine the sound filling the air, the steady rhythm of stone on stone, the voices of people preparing food while rituals unfolded within the circles. In its later phase, the site changed again. Rectangular buildings appeared, their floors made of terrazzo, a polished plaster created by burning limestone until it turned to lime and mixing it with stone fragments. The surfaces would have gleamed white in firelight. Some of these rooms held smaller pillars, a continuation of the symbols that had once stood in giants. The change from circles to rectangles suggests a shift in how people gathered, from wide sanctuaries open to the sky to enclosed rooms where ritual and life may have blended more closely. Taken together, the stones, the carvings, the tools, and the hidden circles beneath the soil point to a truth that still resists full understanding. Here were people who gave shape to stone on a monumental scale, who inscribed symbols of animals and spirits, who may have recorded disaster in images meant to outlast time. Here were gatherings large enough to grind tons of grain and to burn limestone for gleaming white floors. Yet we are left with silence, because most of Göbekli Tepe still sleeps beneath the earth. If the pillars are guardians, what knowledge do they protect? If the vulture stone holds a memory of catastrophe, why was it buried instead of passed on in story? And if hundreds of enclosures remain hidden, what secrets did the builders choose to seal away forever? These questions echo through the site like whispers, reminding us that what we see now may be only the edge of a mystery still waiting to be uncovered. Stay with us, and together we will explore the mystery of why this place was covered in silence. By the middle of the pre-pottery Neolithic B, the life of Göbekli Tepe drew to an end, yet it did not end as most ancient places do. Around 8,000, before the Common Era, the great circles were not abandoned to weather or slow collapse. They were buried, sealed under tons of fill carried by human hands. Archaeologists uncovered this fact in the 1,990 seconds when excavation cut through the layers of soil inside the enclosures. What they found was not natural sediment deposited by wind or rain. The fill was made of limestone rubble hauled from the nearby quarry, the very stone once used to shape the pillars. Mixed into it were flint tools, many of them broken, discarded after their final use. There were also thousands upon thousands of animal bones. These bones were not intact skeletons. They were fractured, split for marrow, burned in fire, and thrown into the pits. The pattern was clear. This was not the silence of neglect. This was deliberate burial. In 2012, a detailed study in antiquity examined the faunal remains and revealed a story of large-scale feasting. Gazelle bones showed cut marks from butchering, aurochs bones bore signs of roasting, and wild boar and red deer were found in similar states. The sheer quantity pointed to gatherings of hundreds of people. Residue suggested that cereals had been fermented into drink, perhaps an early beer. Imagine the scene. Fires blazing against the night, herds hunted and slaughtered, meat roasting on spits, the sound of grinding stones turning grain into flour. Communities came together in numbers never before seen, eating and drinking in rituals that marked not only celebration but closure. When the feasts ended, the remains of the animals, the broken tools, and the quarry rubble were carried into the enclosures. They were poured over the pillars, layer upon layer, until the sanctuaries vanished beneath the earth. Why would a people pour such effort into covering what they had once raised with such devotion? One explanation lies in the transformation of their world. By 8,000, before the Common Era, agriculture was taking root across the Fertile Crescent. Villages grew where barley and einkorn were planted and harvested. Sheep and goats were brought under human management. Life was reorganized around fields, flocks, and permanent homes. In this new order, the seasonal sanctuaries of hunters and foragers may have seemed out of step. Göbekli Tepe belonged to an age that was ending. Its burial may have been a way to close that chapter, a symbolic act that sealed away the monuments of foragers as the age of farmers began. The land itself also played a role. Excavations on the northern slope of the mound revealed signs of erosion and repeated landslides. Walls had been repaired more than once, but the damage returned. The practical challenge of maintaining such vast enclosures on unstable ground may have encouraged the decision to close the site. Yet, if practicality was the spark, the act of burial was far more than repair. It was an undertaking on the scale of construction itself, carried out with ceremony and intent. Scholars debate what this intent meant. The mainstream view is that the sanctuaries lost their function as social life shifted, rituals moved into villages, and Göbekli Tepe was formally closed with feasting and fill. But others suggest a deeper motive. Some describe the burial as a ritual of sealing, a deliberate act to lock away what the site contained. Archaeologist Julia Schonicke has described it as a separation of people from place, a cutting of ties through ritual. In this reading, the fill was not waste but a cover, a lid set over knowledge and memory that were not meant to survive in the open. Here the evidence challenges the textbooks most directly. For decades, scholars believed that monuments, organized feasts, and ceremonial closure only came after farming and settled life. Hunters and foragers, they said, lacked the resources, organization, and symbolic complexity for such feats. Yet Göbekli Tepe stands in quiet defiance. Hunters gathered in their hundreds, built sanctuaries of 10-ton stones, feasted on herds of wild animals, brewed drink from cereals, and then deliberately buried it all. This is not the behavior of simple wanderers. It is the signature of a complex society centuries before agriculture. And then comes the most haunting question. Why bury knowledge instead of carrying it forward? The vulture stone, with its strange headless figure among vultures and scorpions, has been read by some as a ritual image of death. In 2017, researchers proposed that it may encode memory of a cosmic catastrophe at the end of the Younger Dryas, more than 10,000 years ago. If that is true, then Göbekli Tepe's carvings were more than decoration. They were records, warnings in stone. To bury them may have been to hide truths that no longer fit the new world. Whatever the exact reason, the burial of Göbekli Tepe remains one of archaeology's most unsettling puzzles. Unlike Stonehenge, which eroded slowly, or the pyramids, which stood for millennia, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately hidden. It vanished not by accident, but by choice. And the choice it represents overturns what we thought we knew. If people once described as primitive foragers could raise these sanctuaries and bury them with such ceremony, then the story of civilization must be rewritten. So we are left with a question that refuses to fade. If a people 10,000 years ago could hide their greatest achievements beneath the earth, what else has been hidden? And if the knowledge sealed in those stones was dangerous enough to bury, what will it mean for us to uncover it again? The stones of Göbekli Tepe were sealed long ago, yet their legacy did not vanish with the soil that covered them. Instead, they left traces that stretch far beyond one hill in Anatolia, connecting to other sanctuaries, to the beginnings of agriculture, and even to stories told in later ages. In 2018, UNESCO placed Göbekli Tepe on the World Heritage List and named it the earliest monumental sanctuary we know. This recognition marked a quiet turning point. Human history no longer began where we thought it did. The starting line had shifted back thousands of years, into a time we once believed belonged only to wandering hunters. Since then, archaeologists have discovered that Göbekli Tepe was part of something larger. In the rolling country east of Sanliurfa lies Karahan Tepe, a site first surveyed years ago but only seriously excavated from 2019 onward. Beneath the earth there, researchers uncovered more than 250 pillars, arranged in broad halls cut into the living bedrock. Some spaces contain benches, where dozens could have sat in gathering. One chamber holds a sculpture of a human rising out of the floor itself, its face staring upward in eternal silence. Karahan Tepe is only one of more than a dozen sites, together called Tas Tepele, the Stone Hills. Each adds another page to a story we had thought was complete. The land also keeps a secret in its plants. Genetic studies in the last decade traced the origin of einkorn wheat to the slopes of Karakadag, less than 100 kilometers away. This was the cradle of the crop that would sustain civilizations for millennia. The connection is striking. In the same region where sanctuaries of stone rose into the sky, the seeds of agriculture first took root. It may be that the need to sustain large gatherings drove people to cultivate food. If so, then the spark that began farming was not hunger alone, but ritual itself. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe also reach forward in ways that are less material but no less powerful. Some of the T-shaped monoliths bear carved arms, belts, and loincloths. They are not blank stones, but stylized human forms, guardians cast in stone. Their presence recalls myths that surfaced long after. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki, ancient beings who stood between gods and men. In Egypt, towering figures of deities filled the temples, half human and half animal, carved on stone walls aligned with the heavens. In Greece, the old Titans were said to have ruled before the gods of Olympus. None of these cultures knew Göbekli Tepe, yet the image of colossal ancestors echoes across them all, as if a memory had travelled further than we realise. There are also mysteries still buried. Geophysical surveys have shown at least 20 enclosures remain hidden under the mound at Göbekli Tepe. Hundreds of pillars may still sleep in the soil, their carvings unseen since antiquity. Each one could hold symbols that change the way we understand the story. What we know so far may be only the beginning. This is the weight of Göbekli Tepe's legacy. It links to other sanctuaries spread across the land. It stands in the birthplace of wheat. It reverberates in myths carried through distant ages. And it hides more than it has revealed. If Göbekli Tepe is a single doorway, then Tastepila together form a vast library of memory, a record of early imagination and belief still waiting to be opened. The question that lingers is not only what has been found, but what lies unread beneath the soil sealed for 10,000 years. Do you believe Göbekli Tepe was the work of an early civilization long forgotten? If you do, press like and tell us what you think in the comments. Among all the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, there are some that seem to look not only across the land but also toward the sky. In the 2010 seconds, researchers suggested that parts of the site may align with Sirius, the brightest star that rises just before dawn. If so, then these sanctuaries were not only places for ritual on Earth, but also mirrors of the heavens. It would mean that 10,000 years ago, long before Babylon or Greece, people were already charting the night sky and binding their memory of the cosmos into stone. This thought lingers uneasily. We have always been told that astronomy began later, when priests kept records of stars to measure time and guide the calendar. Yet here on the limestone ridge of Anatolia, people we still call hunters and foragers may have been watching the heavens with a precision we do not expect. The T-shaped pillars, some carved with arms and belts, stand not only as ancestors but perhaps as figures that bridged the human and the cosmic. Each circle could have been a stage where Earth met sky, where memory of what was above was anchored firmly below. To imagine this is to wonder how much of our earliest knowledge was never written, but carved into stone and then buried. It is to consider that the story of humanity is not only about survival, but about awareness, imagination, and memory stretching far beyond what we allow in our books. Göbekli Tepe forces us to ask whether knowledge itself can be hidden, locked away not by accident but by choice, waiting to be found again. And so the question remains, if the stars were once recorded in pillars of stone, what else might lie hidden in the soil beneath our feet? How many other secrets, how many other memories still wait for their moment to return to the light? If you enjoyed this journey into the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe, please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Sleep well and good night.